Hello, I'm your host, Effie Pilarinu, and today I'm reaching out around the world to a wonderful lady. We have with us Telly Valerie Onu, who is today in St. Kitts and Nevis, right? Hi, Telly.
Yes. Hi, Effie. Pleasure to be here as well.
It's a great pleasure for my audience. You know, Telly is in my mind a globetrotter. We met a couple of years ago virtually, always virtually, when she was really working on enabling entrepreneurs, giving them tools and know-how around entrepreneurship, innovation, in fintech, in agri-tech, in the next, the future of the web, and so on. She's one of those people that wears a lot of hats and does a lot of things, and we have an opportunity to talk about this. So, dear Telly, tell us a bit about your journey and where you're at today. First of all, with your exotic background, is it something that you see outside your window, or completely, if you want, virtual?
Actually, my exotic background, I'm actually in Nevis. I think it's in Nevis at the moment, and this is the Nevis Peak. And it's something I do actually see out of my window. On the right-hand side, I have a view of the peak. On my left-hand side, I have a view of the ocean.
Beautiful, beautiful. So, as a globetrotter, tell us what you've been up to, your journey, and how you arrived to what you're doing today.
Wow, okay, so where do I start? I would say the journey to where I am today has taken a lot of curves and turns, as with everybody else. So I'm multidisciplinary in my profession. I pretty much started with undergrad medical sciences of all things in Cuba, and then I pivoted. Then I went into electronic commerce, and then I decided to specialize in electronic governance in Switzerland. So I actually went to EPFL in Lausanne,
Oh, I don't know that.
specialized around circa 2008, 2009, around there. That was when Bitcoin obviously pretty much gave birth. And during the program, I really focused on cryptography. I focused on network governance and also innovation governance. This whole term of governance with collective decision-making was pretty much my foundation. And then over the years, I would have applied it in many different sectors. So wearing one of the hats as a management consultant, I have a small boutique firm, Quintessence Consulting, that I've had for about 20 years now. And the focus has always been in digital transformation, obviously applying it to many different industries and sectors. And then in the last, I would say, 7 or 8 years prior, I decided to then kind of hone into not just focusing on doing that building the enabling environment for startups in the ecosystem I'm in, which is the Caribbean, but I also started focusing on the supply side. So this is where I took an interest in specifically finance and digital transformation as it's happening within finance. Back in early 2000, I'll say 11 to 12, I would have actually designed and launched my own mobile payment infrastructure. But I think I was too early then. I was early in a space where adoption is really difficult. And so I had to shelve that for a while, but then I started focusing on other elements of the financial sector. Around 4 or 5 years ago, I specialized also in climate finance in Frankfurt in Germany. And again, because I live in the Caribbean and I also work a lot with entrepreneurs that are in the Caribbean or are in Africa, you tend to see different type of innovations arising from in these areas that are linked to our needs. So as you would have mentioned before, when we had met at that time, we were, I think it was 2017 it was, or something like that.
Around that time, yes.
Yes, so
Oh,
at the
wow.
time, for a previous partnership,
Yeah.
we pioneered the first, you say, blockchain accelerator program. Um, from start to finish, really focusing on entrepreneurs that are actually solving these impact, what I would call the multidimensional impact issues, be it climate, be it agri. And we looked at that and we said, well, if they could optimize their business models and actually incorporate DLT and building out ecosystems, not only would they become sustainable, but they'll actually become profitable. And that set a trend, and we launched that. At the time, we probably launched it. We launched it globally. We had about over 40 applicants around the world, and we selected 20. They covered Caribbean, Africa, North America. We even had people in the Middle East participate in the program. And yes, the journey from there to here. So as we evolve, I met a fantastic group of individuals over the series, and these people actually had come together to kind of launch the Bantu Blockchain Foundation, which is a very new protocol. It's about a year old, and it's anchored in really empowering individuals and really empowering the countries that I say we participate in, meeting the needs of people, meeting the needs of addressing a lot of the adoption issues you find in other blockchains, as well as kind of connecting to the very needs of people, especially in Africa, its diaspora and other countries. So I am actually the head of governance and execution for the Bantu Blockchain Foundation. It's the first protocol, by the way, that actually launched with a bank adopted. So we also focus on
Sorry to interrupt you. Before we go into the Bantu Blockchain Foundation, I want to talk more first about financial inclusion, which is, I think it brings all your experience together and get some of your insights around financial inclusion, especially because you've worked with the Caribbean and in Africa and understand the needs. What is missing? As you already mentioned, in Africa, specifically, innovation is very different than what is happening in the developed, if you want, Western world, and especially around fintech and so on. But what do you see as missing in that part, or what is important from what is happening?
You really ask a really great question. So I think the most important thing that I find is important is beyond the technology, actually. It's really access. Ensuring that people have access to the technology, access to the bare infrastructure, I think is what is critically missing. So if we're looking at Africa specifically, Africa, huge continent, within the countries, you have areas where you are rural and urban. You might find a lot of penetration and access in the urban areas, but then you might not necessarily find the same access in the rural areas. So you have to now get back to the basics, and the basics of infrastructure in a whole, this whole digital infrastructure. Where is it being deployed? How can people access it? At what cost can they access it? Because it could be that there is access, but then the cost to access it is very difficult. So this is where I think it's a fine line, and this is where the digital divide happens. Also, you find technologies that are so anchored in specific devices might actually lock out a number of people from accessing it, because not everybody is going to have a smartphone or could afford a smartphone, right? They might just have a very simple mid-range phone that they can access. So being able to also design your applications to reach the people at the last mile is critically important. Being able to design systems that can actually work offline as well as online is also important. And what's also missing is ensuring that as you move between offline to online, the system is actually secured. It maintains the integrity of the system. So these are the nuances and the challenges, I would say, in Africa. In the Caribbean, yes, you do have some pockets. It's a very diverse area when you talk about the Caribbean, different countries. You might go into what I'll call Caribbean South American brothers, Guyana, Suriname. Again, very similar to Africa. They would have quite vast areas, and there might be some rural areas near the Amazon that might not necessarily be connected, right? But if you're looking at some other areas like the Eastern Caribbean and so on, you might not necessarily see financial inclusion from the same lens. It might just be a perspective of there are many financial services, but maybe it's an issue of they might not necessarily trust, the traditional centralized services and want to have some simplified, more efficient, and of course, affordability is also another criteria. So it varies, but like you did mention, what you're seeing in the northern countries, be it in Europe, in the US, and so on, is vastly different from the developing countries. Things that you take for granted are things that we cannot take for granted. And there are a lot of frictions to doing business as well. So I think that's one of the key areas. How, if we can address some of the frictions of doing business in both Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, then I think we would be addressing a lot of the issues for adoption, greater adoption.
Great, Telly. Which brings me to ask you, I cannot not ask you about the central bank digital currencies, since I guess
Right.
the Caribbean has the crown of being first, even though, of course, China, with its size, will go down in history, but clearly the Caribbean has been in the forefront, the Eastern Caribbean, in terms of CBDC adoption. What is your take of CBDCs in the Caribbean and in general?
Well, CBDCs obviously is more of a country implementation. In the case of the Eastern Caribbean, because we have a union, right, a currency union, it just so happened that within the union, one of the greatest needs is really reduction of costs. So you would say the goals and the motivation for implementation of CBDC sort of vary. And I think one of the big factors is really driving costs, because you can imagine the central bank needs to move money, cash around, traveling between countries. And you can imagine what happened with the pandemic. It was just literally a nightmare. So one of the, I think the key goals was really to reduce costs, improve efficiency as one of that. And then as a secondary factors, also then looking at perhaps addressing inclusion. The Caribbean is very unique in the context that over the, I would say over 100 years or so, banking has been kind of dominated by the Canadian banks. So if you look at the history of the Caribbean with the whole colonialism, et cetera, you would have certain infrastructures were put in place to facilitate previous trading relationships. So when some countries dealt with monocrops, such as banana, some dealt with sugar, etc. So you needed these financial infrastructures to support it. And in very early, Canada had established relationships with the Caribbean. So you would find, or at least in the last decade or so, you would have found pretty much in every island, you had the presence of the big, Bank of Nova Scotia's, RBTT, all these Canadian banks in there. But over time, the landscape has started changing, where you started getting a growing number of indigenous banks launching and offering their services. So the big challenge the Caribbean has always had is its openness to the rest of the world, right? By just being, a small island small islands in nature, obviously certain policies might not necessarily be supported by, say, other countries. For instance, because our size is small, when you look at our tax regimes are a little bit more fluid because of the small size, right? Mm-hmm. So that provides opportunity for arbitrage, regulatory arbitrage. So in the past, obviously, you had a rise of people coming into the region because of offshore banking, et cetera, because obviously policies were more lenient towards that. So that meant, and banking holistically, even in Switzerland, all over the world, they weren't really set up to monitor their customers. They would just have their customers, onboard customers would have their funds, et cetera. So when you had the global movement for, anti-money laundering, counterterrorism, fraud, and all of that, regulation started to come down. Obviously, it imposes a lot of additional costs to these financial institutions to implement. And I think, quote unquote, for me personally, if you had a scenario where 60% of the banking market share was done by Canadian banks, right? And over time, as these things come down, they start to de-risk themselves from the perspective of moving out of certain areas. The countries themselves also start de-risking in terms of implementing more favorable policies. So that has been happening in many countries. And the banking sector just started evolving and changing. So because of this de-risking, and if you look at correspondent banking relationships, this is where it's really a fine line. If you have a bank, you're in the middle of an island somewhere with a bank, and you don't have the ability to connect with another bank, then you're totally locked out of the system. So this is what the de-risking process does. And what had happened is not just the Canadian banks, the US banks may not necessarily have had physical presence, but they've had like relationships, and some of them still do have relationships with banks, started to sort of just, shut down those operations or close down accounts. So that threat of de-risking obviously is an impetus to start looking at financial innovation and how we can use that to better improve our transparency, better, create an alternative system if possible, hence CBDCs, but also it also serves the opportunity to implement RegTech solutions to really provide confidence to our existing banking partners in America, in the US, and in Canada that we have a very sound system and we're also streamlining. So I think the impetus for that change in the Caribbean is vastly different from what you would see in Africa, where in Africa, the motive is mostly financial inclusion, right?
Yeah, remittances and financial inclusion in that sense, and cross-border micropayments and so on.
Cross-border micropayment.
Yeah. Whereas what you are describing, and thank you very much for this wonderful overview of the history and the particularities, trade and economic relations of the region, what I'm hearing from you is that the CBDCs in the Caribbean hopefully will be a way to gain efficiencies in correspondent banking, which is pretty crucial, right, for the economies of the Caribbean.
Yes, I think at the moment, they're more focused on the domestic market and improving efficiencies between internally. But I think where you're going to see CBDCs really count is dealing with cross-border interoperability for sure. Right. So right now you have the first CBDC was the Bahamas, then you have the Eastern Caribbean amongst its 8 countries. And then you have other, and Jamaica also pretty much is piloting a CBDC as well. So you have obviously different jurisdictions with their own CBDC, which is more focused internally. But when you start to get more and more CBDCs, then that opportunity for cross-border interoperability to unlock trade and unlock those additional efficiencies then becomes interesting. So I think we're not there yet, but it is pretty much the roadmap to what you've just described. Like,
Great. So now, Telly, let's talk about your love and now the Bantu Blockchain Foundation. What is the mission, and you know what is happening in this ecosystem that you are devoting your time and energy?
Okay, so I'm part of the core team. I'm the head of governance and execution for the Bantu Blockchain Foundation. It is actually a nonprofit. It was registered in Seychelles, as you know, with most of these foundations. And its focus is really on maintaining and supporting the first layer protocol. So we have a protocol, it's a decentralized ledger. It uses a modified federated Byzantine agreement as part of its consensus. So it facilitates open membership, but within the network, you actually have federated systems, similar to the Swiss, how the Swiss governance is in Switzerland in that context. So it really is robust. Like I mentioned to you when we launched last year, we launched with actually Sterling Bank as one of our partners. Sterling Bank has been onboarded and is developing a number of applications using the infrastructure. And the ecosystem started off with first building out the community. So it launched a number of tools. It has baked within its infrastructure a wallet infrastructure, a multi-asset wallet, which is very unique for a blockchain, a layer 1 blockchain protocol. Normally, layer 1 blockchain protocols don't have all these additions embedded in it. So it's got wallet infrastructure embedded, it's got a token creator embedded. So it will enable anyone to create their own tokens, enables anyone to kind of build its own wallet infrastructure. And it has its own native wallet called Bantu Pay as a solution. And then, of course, it has its own token called the XBN. And for the most part, we actually set up an office in Nigeria, decided to start off where the biggest pain point is and where the concentration of one of the highest concentration in Africa in terms of crypto users, right, to actually implement. And we started doing the Banter expansion last month, where we actually launched in Ghana. And the Bantu expansion is moving across the continent. So if you kind of look up in your history of Bantu, who were the Bantu people, how did they expand, and how they grew across the world to kind of expand in other areas. It's pretty much is not just an infrastructure, I would say it is a movement, kind of reliving our ancestral our ancestral, should I say, springboard to the world, but this time empowering humanity to use certain technologies. So,
Okay, so if we move at a higher level above the
mhm.
technology, above the infrastructure, what kind of projects do you envision being built on this blockchain? What is the community interested in? Are there already projects being built? Can you give us some examples of I don't know, minimum viable products? What direction are you taking? Because there's so much, if you put an infrastructure out there, where does
Yes.
it go? What's its focus?
Okay, so at the moment, it's okay. In terms of the infrastructure, it does have many different target, many different multi-stakeholders. If you're looking at the developer community has access to a number of toolkits, APIs that they could use to launch their own projects. If you're looking at the business community can use the blockchain infrastructure for many different things, for improving provenance of things. So if you're looking at sector-wise, think about pharmaceutical industry. They can use it for tracking provenance and reducing fraud, right? And counterfeit. We're seeing humanitarian projects. So there is a particular humanitarian project being launched by one of our partners, Convexity, and they have implemented a system where they're a payment system where they're providing some very specific support to people who are, what's the word? I've just forgotten the word. People who are displaced. Yeah, refugees. That's the word. People who are displaced and refugees. So they get, it's like almost like a digital voucher system. So you're already starting to see some sort of impact projects being implemented.
You mean
As the
a
next
universal
example.
basic income scheme, so to speak, or a digital
So
identity rather?
no, we have digital identity being implemented and deployed, but also like a universal basic income. And, uh, it's like social cash transfers where you have certain programs that they're working with other development agencies that need to have these conditional cash transfers. These are being done leveraging the infrastructure as well. And
So,
there are a number of other partnerships that the infrastructure is garnering right now. I cannot mention, it's a bit too early, but you will hear some announcements globally, as in it's not just in Africa, but we're actually spreading out in other countries as well.
and Telly, am I understanding correctly that, okay, the developer community can come in, but also existing businesses and organizations that are operating already with different missions could leverage this technology to improve the transparency of their processes, the efficiency of their processes, and so on?
That is correct. That is correct. And there's so many different verticals. Like for instance, a nice simple one would be in agriculture, reinventing and redesigning commodity exchanges using digital assets. So because we facilitate multi-assets, so anyone can, create their own tokens and launch them and have these fungible tokens as assets that they can use to kind of monetize. So that's a project we're seeing there, and we're seeing many of those applications as well. And the fact that we have a very simple mechanism of no code token creation, it also facilitates and encourages other people for launching. We also support the creative economy, or should I say the creator economy, in a very big way, because as you know, there's a growth of NFTs, and Africa has a lot of talented people. That sector is huge if you were to divide it between artists and so on. So you're actually seeing a growing number of projects around NFTs that are actually being launched. And then we also have like some complementary partners like Timbuktu. So we actually have a peer-to-peer exchange that was launched, Timbuktu Marketplace, and that's been pretty active. Um, we have another partner that launched a gaming solution. So we're seeing games that kind of leverage the native token as well. So there are many projects that are coming to the fore, from sports, entertainment, to actually core, banking, very serious banking. And we're also kind of working in the space of CBDCs as well. We have a framework to facilitate country CBDCs.
Great. I will share with our audience the link to the Bantu Blockchain Foundation so they can explore. Telly,
Right.
before we close our conversation, I really want to discuss and hear your insights around where we women stand in this accelerated transformation. And, we all know the issues around women participation. How do you see it in this wave of building new infrastructure, be it for finance, be it for Web3, for social platforms, for, anything you can imagine?
Wow. Being a woman myself, I would say it's really the growth and the emergence of this new space, and the evolution of the space. I think it serves as an opportunity to empower women. I think more women have an opportunity to um, articulate their voices, because as in traditional finance, it's always a struggle for women to have a seat at the table. So while we started seeing in the very beginning, when the blockchain started, it seemed to be very heavy tech. Only if you're really a woman in tech would you be able to participate. But I think now, as you're seeing more and more models evolve, especially in the DeFi space, you're starting to get a lot more inclusion as women are starting to become aware of what they can do, how they can empower themselves, either as an investor, because you have a lot more women who have started like acquiring different tokens to invest. So there's empowerment on that end, because they realize that, listen, by diversifying into these alternative tokens, they're able to increase their wealth. So that's one I would say one area women are participating in. Another area women are participating in are actually in supporting a lot of these projects being launched. You're finding along the whole business value chain, women tend to be very, how do I put it? We're multidisciplinary, multitaskers, but we also have our hands on the pulse in terms of the different trends that are happening. So we tend to be more plugged in and more astute. So I think uh, any project, including women, will actually benefit from that type of diversity. And especially since we are also in an area of, you could call it unconventional, uncertain innovation, right? I think women have a knack for being a tad bit more creative, but also being able to steer teams into the right place, because we also deal with the way we address risk management. We take measured risks. So I think that's another area women are being involved. In the area of the DAOs, I find more and more women are able to then spin up and launch a DAO project. And especially also in the impact space, you have a lot more women being able to then leverage DAOs to really accelerate impact or amplify their impact. So for me, I think it's a very positive trajectory. And seeing that it's new and an evolving space, you don't necessarily have that opportunity for the traditional gender sentiment, for the male sentiment to set in. I think it's really an opportunity for women to actually redefine how they're engaging with these technologies and basically using it for the benefit of themselves, their families, etc. So for me, holistically, I see it as a really positive, um, a positive, opportunity. If we're looking back at the previous conversation we had about financial inclusion, that would also really involve targeting women as well and having women, just simple digital IDs and being able to have some sort of alternative account would do a lot to empower women. So I think we have a responsibility for us who are already in this space to kind of share and educate other women with the different type of opportunities that are emerging in the space that are not necessarily all about tech. Because as we were discussing, it isn't really all about tech. There is a big opportunity for digital transformation, which women can actually participate in and support.
As you said, this is unconventional innovation. It's sweeping innovation through our social life, and not including women would be a huge design error.
Mhm.
100%. There's no doubt about that. Telly, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your experience and invaluable insights about these areas that are converging in or overlapping, if you want, and we can't just say, oh, I'm fintech, you're agri-tech, you are this, you are that, I'm a banker,
Yeah, yes.
right? I'm a retailer. Everything's really coming together, and these technologies, we should see them as an opportunity to come together and create new things and empower more people. If we keep that in mind, we'll find better use cases, better not only for the businesses, better for the society. So
Yes,
it's
agree.
this is the kind of vision that people like you inspire the rest of the women and the men, the girls and the boys, to look at the world and from their point of view contribute in this way. Telly will follow your journey with the nonprofit Bantu Blockchain Foundation. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Effie, for having me on your show.